Hello, everyone. Nice to see you. And Barry Miller, who I know quite well, and glad to see him again. Yeah, I lectured here back in, I guess it was 2013, about volume one of the what ended up to be a three-part biography of James Hillman, who I had gotten to know. I decided to make this talk a rather personal one. We're also on talking to people on Zoom, right? Um, that will get into my relationship with Hillman, how it came to be, how he helped me in some ways, and I'll certainly be talking about his work here as well, and that's where I'm going to start. But I thought that would be interesting to folks to hear about, and yeah, I never expected to write a three-volume biography of this amazing man, but that's what it ended up being, and we'll get into that too. I think this is his 100th birthday this year. He was born in 1926. Um, so it's a centennial celebration year, and I think there'll be some events that his wife, Margot McLean, will be doing. And it's also the 50th anniversary of publication of Revisioning Psychology, which was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize back when it came out in 1975-6. And so it's a big anniversary year to celebrate Hillman's life and work. And so just wanted you all to know that. I'm going to start with a brief reading of that summarizes who he was. And he died in October of 2011. So that's, 14 years ago now, at the age of 85 from the complications of cancer. And this is from an obituary that I thought was really good about him that summarizes who he was, and I'll start with that. Hillman's been hailed as the most important American psychologist since William James. He was a dedicated subversive, witty and original, and an heir to the Jungian tradition, which he reimagined with unceasing brilliance. Fiercely critical of America's dedication to the pursuit of happiness, Hillman focused on the darkest and most difficult human experiences: illness, depression, failure, and suicide, and merely abnormal pathologies that should be avoided, not nearly as avoided pathologies that should be avoided or cured. He drew on the writers and philosophers of the Italian Renaissance and ancient Greece, as well as a romantic tradition that included Keats, Goethe, Schelling, and others. Not wishing to create a school of his own, he proposed an archetypal or imaginal psychology that would restore the psyche or soul to a discipline he believed to have been diminished by scientific and medical models. Influenced by the French Islamist and Sufi Henri Corbin, the poetics of Gaston Bachelard, and the phenomenology of Maurice Merleau-Ponty, he argued that reality is a construct of the imagination, the stuff of myth, dreams, fantasies, and images. There was, however, very little about his thought that was divorced from the world of money, war, and politics. His unrelenting cultural critique embraced everything from masturbation to plastic surgery and the design of ceilings to U.S. foreign policy. The image as an expression of the imagination in poetry, dreams, or visual art was of paramount importance to him, as an antidote to the literalism that dominates everyday discourse. Hillman warned against the reductive tendencies of interpretation and theoretical speculation. He would advocate sticking to the image, whose often indistinct or paradoxical language spoke, he argued, with more authenticity than verbal discourse. Hillman drew on pre-Christian modes of thought, a polytheistic perspective, reflecting the myriad possibilities of the human psyche, imagined as gods and goddesses, myths and metaphors, whose polymorphous nature spoke for the instincts that shape our thoughts and actions more truthfully than the good and evil world of oppositions central to the monotheistic religions. Hillman grew up in Atlantic City, New Jersey, with parents in the hotel business. They partly owned the George Cinq in Paris, in a seaside resort that sold and lived by illusion. He spoke of learning early on about things not always being what they seemed. The Second World War, he served in the U.S. Navy Hospital Corps, looking after blind people, an experience that exposed him to the sightless patient's rich inner life, as well as convincing him of the pitfalls of institutional medicine. After studying at the Sorbonne and Trinity College in Dublin, he traveled to Africa and spent a year in Kashmir, where he discovered the writings of Jung. He returned to Europe to work on a PhD at the University of Zurich and enrolled on a diploma course at the Jung Institute in 1950. Soon after qualifying, he became the director of studies in Zurich and remained in Zurich until 1978. During this time, he published groundbreaking works, including Revisioning Psychology, 1975, based on the prestigious Terry lectures he'd given at Yale in 1973. This Pulitzer-nominated book was followed by The Dream in the Underworld in 1979 and The Myth of Analysis, 1983. In these central studies, Hillman set out with great erudition as well as a gift for subversion to see through the idea and practice of psychology, the way in which we extract meaning from dreams, and the guiding fictions behind the practice of psychoanalysis. Hillman left Zurich after 25 years to become the graduate dean at the University of Dallas, where he remained until 1984 and also set up the Dallas Institute of Humanities and Culture, which fostered the radical appraisal of cities, and our lives within them. He also edited the journal Spring and was chief editor of Spring Publications. Having practiced as an analyst for 40 years, he eventually became highly critical of therapy. He argued that the sickness of humanity lay in the world rather than within each person. Therapy should, he believed, change politics, cities, buildings, schools, and our relationship with the natural environment, rather than focus solely on people's inner lives. He moved on to find a wider audience through a series of popular but still provocative books, including The Soul's Code, which reached the #1 on the New York Times bestseller list, and The Force of Character, works which explored, with examples running from Picasso to Hitler, the idea that we all have a calling, an individual and innate character which shapes our lives. In A Terrible Love of War in 2004, he reflected on humanity's abiding martial ardor and the need for the periodic spilling of blood at great cost and with incalculable suffering. As well as writing beautifully, texts of layered intellectual exposition that were dense yet always skillfully articulated, Hillman was an electrifying lecturer and teacher, a tall and charismatic mixture of rabbinical scholar and comedian, with a breathtaking ability to lead his audience through arguments that turned accepted ideas upside down. Unlike other critics of the mainstream approach to mental illness, he was not anti-anything, seeing in opposition a fantasy that drew us away from meaning and from life. He preferred to deconstruct, often playfully, whether he was speaking of plastic surgery, the politics of the Middle East, or the paranoia of the psychiatric profession. Not surprisingly, he approached death through a period of great physical suffering, with courage, humor, and a continuing curiosity about the fictions that surround our ideas of life and death. I thought that was a beautiful, tribute to him and his life. It summarized so much about him. And, I met him initially in 1998, I think it was. My friends and I live in a large extended family. We'd been studying him, came upon him in the mid-1990s, and even had little seminar classes among each other about him. And then one day, in the kitchen of our home in Boston, we were talking about Hillman, and one of the kids who'd grown up in our family suddenly said, "Oh, my dad knows James Hillman. He sells his vegetables in the organic market in Connecticut." I said, "Wow, Henry, really, your dad knows?" Because I knew his dad, and he used to live with us. And I said, "Do you think I could maybe meet him sometime?" And so I called his dad, and Wayne said, "Well, he's very private. I don't know if that'll happen." But I sent him a copy of a book I'd written called Black Genius and the American Experience. And apparently he read it, and or at least went through it and liked it, and agreed to have a lunch. So my wife and I went up to meet with him in Connecticut. Didn't meet his wife yet, and but we found we had quite a lot in common. We were 21 years apart in age, and I was not a psychologist. I was a psychiatrist or anything. I was an investigative journalist, and but he was. I was also a big advocate of the environment, and he was working on trying to stop a big sewer project from going in at his house. And so I put him in touch with a friend from the EPA that helped out with that. And I had a book. I think I don't know if I had it with me then, but I wrote a book called Eye of the Whale that had just come out, and it's a wonderful story about these friendly gray whales that come up to people in the lagoons in Baja, Mexico, and the mothers will actually introduce themselves to people in these small pangas. And the president of Mexico had come with his wife to this lagoon. They were going to build this massive salt works there, industrial salt works. And there was a big environmental movement against this. So the president who was doing this with Mitsubishi came there, and his wife ended up kissing a whale because the whale came up to the boat. So I told this story, and I remember James Hillman said, "The whales saved themselves," which they did. He talked about his chickens that he raised as real psychology majors, and he wondered. We talked a little bit about astrology. He was a double Aries with sun and moon conjunct, and I was a Leo with 5 planets in Leo, and he said, "Oh, that's just as bad." So at the end of that day, there was a rainbow that came through the storm clouds, and he'd signed my wife Alice's book, one of his books, I think it was Soul's Code, at a first meeting before the next. So the next time we met his wife, Margot, who I had pictured as this kind of, they said they had a farmhouse in Connecticut, and so I sort of pictured this, I don't know, large older lady, and I was very pleasantly surprised to see that Margot was quite a bit younger than he, and quite beautiful and wonderful to be with. And it turned out that her grandmother had lived 10 blocks from where my wife grew up on the south side of Chicago. So again, there were these connections, and I think I showed him then the whale book, and Margot, I remember asking, do you write in the morning? And Hillman looked at this tome of a book, which is sort of like the biography too, and said, "No, he writes all day." so, so then he came to our home in Los Angeles, and stayed with us for a little while. And he said, I remember, and I started jotting little things down that he would mention. He said, this was after 9/11, and he said, the towers haven't really fallen yet. We haven't reached the bottom, which I'm afraid has become a prime metaphor for where we are now. He was out at the time when he was walking the Civil War battlefields, and he wasn't ready to talk yet about his book, A Terrible Love of War. But I remember him saying that, Bonnie and Clyde were a lot realer than Lewis and Clark. And this time I remember he signed another book to Alice and said, "We were brought together not by fate, but by its instrument, Wayne's potato," the organic farmer that we met him through, right? I remember asking him what was it like being around Jung, because in Switzerland, he'd arrived in Zurich in 1953 when Jung he didn't actually take a course from him, but he would meet with the students. He enrolled in the Jung Institute. He was going through a real crisis in his early 20s. And so I asked him, what was it like being around Jung? And he said, it was like being too close to the sun. You just listened. I also asked him why he stopped doing analysis. And he said, I got too old. He said, I couldn't stay awake. So, no more listening to the wife and husband problems. He said, he told me the story of when because he wanted to be a writer when he was young. And so when he'd gone to Kashmir with his first wife, Kate. I write about all this in volume 1 of the book, which some of you may have seen. And said he was very frustrated with this novel he was trying to write. It just wasn't going anywhere. And he suddenly realized, I just don't know if I can do this. He didn't finish it. And he said one day, when he was in Zurich, he was walking along the street And suddenly this flash of insight came to him, which was that I could write about psychology. And so he did, with more than 20 books over the years and a whole new approach to psychology, archetypal psychology that had not been really done before. And again, he was talking about the Titanic metaphor. He said, I remember, what do you do on a sinking ship? Do you pray? He was big questions. And he said, Zeus won because he had imagination. The war book, he felt like for the first time, he had to write about what was happening now, but he still didn't want to talk about it. Then I hadn't yet been to his home, but I went to his home in Thompson, Connecticut, and saw the upstairs office where he writes in longhand and does, cut and paste still on his, instead of the old fashioned way with his books. And on the walls up there were all his photos of his ancestors. And there were paintings by Margot, the crows that she loved to paint. So I remember we went back a couple times at that point. So we were just becoming friends, really. And I remember the next time we went up, he was wearing a cap that read, "There's no fool like an April fool." And he was a funny man. I mean, he really had a great sense of humor. And he would, we kept finding these commonalities between us. We both liked to drink Bass ale. We both loved boxing. And I had, in my younger days, known Muhammad Ali. And then it turned out that his mother and I had the same birthday, August 19th. We both loved old movies, and he'd become friends with Elia Kazan, the great director of the 50s, who did On the Waterfront, among others. And so one time I remember we were sitting there, we just suddenly burst into an imitation from On the Waterfront. "Quit breathing that clam sauce on me." That was when we were at dinner, so it was kind of appropriate. So then they came to visit us in Boston. I found him an acupuncturist that he needed to help with. And, he talked about how we're at the end of a cycle, which many of us know about. It's like a 2,000 some year cycle, and even longer, 25,000 years in the Mayan tradition. But he talked about how at the end of a cycle, a long cycle, because we were going into Aquarius from the age of Pisces, the old religion hangs on with a vengeance. And, they said words like virtue and charity become parodies of what they meant in the Bible. Talked about the war books for the first time. I had some things happening to him. I remember he went into, as he was writing it, he went into a grocery store and fell and hit his head. I mean, he was struggling with trying to finish this in a real personal way as well. He said at one lecture, went to a lecture he did, and he said, "You don't get anywhere in a conversation. You just keep walking back and forth." And a woman, thanked him at that lecture he was giving for his sermon, and he raised his hand and he said, "Peace, my child." So he would, do these things just naturally. Said, "We believe in America more than we live in it." True too. So when it came to biography, though, I mean, he had never wanted to do have a biography done of him. And he even had a folder that he put things in that he wanted to remember about biography, which was one of them was it contained all these quotes. One of them was from J.M. Barrie, who wrote Peter Pan, who said, "May God blast anyone who writes a biography of me." And Freud, at 29, just like Charles Dickens, made a bonfire of his papers. And he said, "As for the biographers, let them worry. I'm already looking forward to seeing them go astray." So that was kind of where Hillman was coming from. I mean, he never wanted to do this. And, so you may ask, why me? How did this happen? And because again, but I wasn't someone who even knew the field that well. But I was fascinated by it. I discovered Jung when I was in my early 20s and I was traveling around the world. And so I read Jung, just thought he was fantastic. And then the same later when I was reading Hillman. But what happened was in January of 2004, Hillman's older sister, Sue, came to visit them in Connecticut, and I was there. Afterwards, I said, you really ought to tape some of her memories while she's around, because she really has great stories and all about their growing up in Atlantic City. And so this gave him the idea to bring his siblings, and there were 4 children together in one place, and as many of his kids as could come, and film it. And I knew a young filmmaker who'd grown up in my family, and she came to do that. And his old friend Kenny Donahue from Ireland showed up, and so it was really quite an event. And as the journalist in the room, I guess, I would ask a lot of questions and kind of draw people out on some of these memories as they were being filmed. Again, without any designs on being a biographer. But then our wives got together actually and started talking about, was he ever going to do this? And then, they agreed that he might, and that if so, he would. I called him and he'd want me to do it. So I remember him saying to me, "This will take years, and he was right. It did. But it was wonderful because he, of course, was still alive. And initially, well, first he had all these letters that had been saved, that he'd written to his parents when he was traveling all over the place and in the World War II and so on. So it was a real gold mine of material for somebody who wanted to write a biography. So I got to photocopy all these letters. And then, there were many, many interviews that I had to do. And the first thing we did was we went together to Ireland with Alice and with Margot, where he'd gone to school at Trinity College in Dublin, and become very close friends with J.P. Dunleavy, the then famous novelist who wrote The Ginger Man in the 50s. And I remember we showed up at Dunleavy's house, and he looked at us and he said, "Well, James, I don't know if I've ever met anyone who was traveling with their biographer." So we began, I went to Switzerland with him at that time. We began working together on this. I mean, I would write a chapter and I would bring it to him to read, and he would always expand upon what I'd written. It wasn't like he wanted to change it or anything. It would give him new ideas. So that was a wonderful thing, to be able to share that, and as I went along. And at one point, we went to Pacifica, where Graduate Institute, where some of you may know, he did visiting lectures for a long, long time, seminars. And he gave this, we were doing kind of a fundraiser for the book. And so he and I both gave talks. And this was never published anywhere. So it's new in terms of people knowing about it. But I wanted to share some of what he wrote for this event, because it really is insightful both about him, who he was, and biography and how you do it. And what he said was this. He said, "An evening such as this has a confessional aspect, because all autobiography is really confession, and so is biography, although conceived and slanted by other people. Now, I had long thought that I really hadn't that much to confess. I had not a fantastic or fascinating life or ancestry or childhood or war record or adventures. I had not lived among extraordinary people whose names you drop and gossip to expose, and my sins and scandals, seductions and secrets were neither lurid nor luminous. In other words, I was not a very good story, only the work. After all, that's been my life, the work. So when I was asked once on a lecture tour by a family I was staying with, and another time teaching a men's retreat, 'Who are you really? I'd like to get to know you really,' I blew up. Ballistic, as they say, because all of me is exposed there, and bravely, when I write it, and speaking and standing up and exposed to the eyes. The actual presence is what is here. What was being asked for was the confessional and personal details of gossip, put into the conventional frame of a reductive biography. Because of your mother, because of your school trouble, because of your being the youngest in the family, because of the divorce, because of the illness in your 7th year, because of your father's bankruptcy or his drinking or his not drinking or whatever. but some reason for who you really are. The question is one of the personalistic psychoanalytic story. That's what getting to know you has come to mean after 100 years of psychobiography. And if that's what the real me is, then I'm not real and I'm not me. So, of course, my very essence, as expressed in all I've written and thought, is against this idea of what a person really is and how we can be explained by, or the work reduced to, the upbringing, forebears. Little wonder then that my skin crawled when I was approached by authors who'd like to do a biography. Besides, the tales of life, to be of any interest, ought to have a lesson in them. Perhaps that's an old-fashioned fantasy, a Jewish fantasy or a Japanese fantasy. You only tell a tale of something that happened when you can draw a moral, a general truth from it. And I don't have that ability. Confession to me was simply that remembered events. I was there, I did that, I felt this, I wished that, utterly blank as far as a learning that could profit others. I didn't feel I had a life worth telling about. In fact, but for the work, I didn't feel I had a life at all. A chronology, yes, a CV, but not a biography, a tale that others could read and gain from. So what is a biography really? He said it should be a narrative with lessons as to how geography affects vision, as to how ancestors continue as guiding ghosts, about appetite and the interplay of timidity and temerity, lessons about rebellion and aggression and the influence of unusually odd friends, and the undercurrents of destiny and character, felt even in the midst of opportunism, scattered follies, and loneliness. A destiny seemingly ruled mainly by luck, chutzpah, and indefatigable hard work. That's the way he pictured what I was going to have to tackle. The great question of biography is what Henry James called the figure in the carpet. How to discern a definite pattern, a comprehensible figure. That's the question for the undercover investigator. He must make sense of the archival data. The shelves that are stored here at Opus, interviews, recorded talks, notes, conversations, stills, photographs, publications, scribbles, scraps. How do all the threads form a figure in the carpet on which a life stands? How do they become a bios, which is the Greek word for a life lived in the world? A distinction through zoe, the Greek word for life, the force of life. How does this zoe, the force of life, present itself in the bios? Not of the person, but of the life lived out in its work as a psychologist. A person who is not only a man with a life, but a person that is psychology, a personification of psychology. What makes a person into a painter, an actor, an architect, a banker, or a surgeon? We look for early clues and early talents. Where do such clues show in psychology? How does a person become psychology? Or is psychology something different? That's the challenge that Dick Russell faces. The accumulated material, trunks of it, files and tapes, and what really is a psychologist? What is it? I mean, this impossible profession, as it's been called. A field, a profession that so dominated the minds and personal lives, the marriages, the choices, the children, even the art and politics of Western society during the entire 20th century. Fully unknown, mind you, before 1900. The answer to this question will have to come from Dick Russell's investigations. Hints are already at hand. What makes a psychologist is neither a life lived in the field, the business of psychology, your parents who were psychologists or afflicted with psychology one way or gifted, or an education in psychology, not even an initiation into the tradition by immersion in mental problems and disorders, nor professional training, the certificates and diplomas on the wall. Rather, it seems simply by imagining psychologically. The word psychology says what it is: psyche and logos. Soul, speech. Psychobabble, a talking cure, or the cure of talk. Finding, giving language to soul. Finding, giving soul to language, to everything you see. You see, psychology is not mind study, as if psyche equals mind and mind equals brain, which is today's favorite equation. Think about it. Psychology can't always be the logos of human development, about the behavior and these thoughts and patterns. we must really and always not forget soul, or the claim has no legitimacy. So perhaps we are each psychology, especially when ignoring psychology. But by keeping this curious, indefinable word soul, by imagining psychologically a kind of negative capability, a turn to John Keats, but different than his even, rather a capability for negativity, dissatisfaction with the conventional, a dissatisfied imagining, continually, forcefully, uncomfortably, without solace, a breakthrough to soul, which I came to call pathologizing back in 1973 at the Terry Lectures at Yale. I didn't know then that I was formulating my own biography. Aristotle said, we become what we are by practice. A basketball player by working to improve his shots, a novelist by writing stories, or a banker by thinking about numbers. And a psychologist becomes such by engagement with psyche. But here's the rub. Psyche is not a field like the others. It has no real definition and no limits. It's everywhere, in everything. Anima mundi, soul of the world. Keats said, think of the world as the veil of soul making. The world is made of soul. The psychologist, therefore, becomes such by entering the world, entertaining the world in the mind, the whole wide world itself, translated in images, imagined, formulated in language. Traces of the world become mind through words, not necessarily people, their behaviors and dreams. For the soul extends beyond humans and in nature. No, nothing less than Keats said, consider the world, the whole wide world. So I thought that was a pretty incredible talk that he gave, and I saved it and glad to share it with you today. As we were working on this, it was certainly not an easy task at all. I don't think I'd ever attempted anything like this. I'd never written a biography. I'd done a lot of investigative journalism, written extensively about the environment, about who killed JFK, genius of African Americans. But at the time, it felt like everything was leading me toward preparation for this biography, which was pretty scary. I tend in my work to overdo. He used to say I was overeating. He said, you continue to seek out new people to talk to. You've got enough already. You've got more information to digest. And what he said, he made a list of themes. No, he asked me to make a list of themes. Okay, what are you going to cover in this book? And so I wrote down 8 essential themes of the work. And it's not that long, so I'll share it with you. Number 1, an emphasis on soul rather than ego and self that includes embracing the pathologies rather than trying to cure them. Depression, then, is not to be avoided, but it's of value, a message emanating from the soul and important to its development. Soul is a symbol, not a concept, existing at an ambiguous middle ground of personal experience and a window into the unknown depths. Soul must be the root of therapy, and its language should be soul-carrying, altogether different from scientific and medical language. Number 2, the importance of images in coming to a poetic basis of life. In other words, in our dreams and fantasies, in seeing through to a deeper understanding, images as living realities through the realms of literature, art, myth, and alchemy. Following from that, number 3, an emphasis on the aesthetic and the sense of beauty, noticing what is around us. Number 4, connecting classical mythology and contemporary psychology. We need to rediscover through our imagination and fantasies our polytheistic nature, peopled by many gods and goddesses. Also, the importance of ancestral figures, not necessarily of the immediate family tree. Number 5, engaging Jung and reworking his psychology, carrying his work and thought beyond inner circles and clinical institutes into a dialogue with the main intellectual streams of our culture. Also rearranging the work of Freud. 6, the importance of anima mundi, soul in the world. Psychoanalysis needs to go beyond the personal and subjective to address the relationship between individual problems, in quotes, and those of the larger culture, for example, the environment, the built world, and so on. We're unconscious of the psyche of the world around us because we are too embroiled with our childhood, sexuality, parental milieu, feelings, etc. 7, there is a shadow to therapy itself. Its emphasis on the subjective, scientific, redemptive Christianism, and institutionalization as a profession. It's lost its roots in cultural criticism. And finally, number 8, connecting the psyche of today back to its animal, tribal, and instinctual cultural roots and to its alchemical nature, away from monotheism and scientific materialism. So that's what I came up with, and he liked that. So, it was certainly an outline that I could follow in tracing the various aspects of his life. And he was very excited about certain things, but he was coming to these realizations, and this is another one he shared with me. He said, another chapter that's connected is my writing, my ideas do not come from practical experience. I have nothing that comes out of life. So it's almost as if my imagination doesn't need life. And that's a hell of a big thing. I need books, but I don't think I need life. I never wrote a word about American male or American men with all my experience in the men's groups for 10 or 12 years. I never wrote anything about Switzerland or the European mind. Nothing comes out of where I've been, what I do. My connection to Italy, which is huge, by the way, is out of the book. The ideas about Italy that I have. I don't use practical examples. I don't write about cases. And I said, that's also your resistance to biography, that your life experience, as you've said, isn't that interesting to you personally. He says, well, when you make something of it, that's what we're trying to do now. And I said, so from books, but where does inspiration come from? He says, that I have to think about. Where does it come from? I said, because you're obviously putting yourself in these remote places where something could come through you that couldn't in other places. He says, in 18 years of writing Eranos lectures and things like that up there in northern Sweden, you couldn't find anything there that has any roots. So I said, so it's not the place per se, and it's not your personal experience. But, he says, something is allowed to happen in those places. That's probably more. I was going to say the way novelists work, but that isn't true. Novelists often get stuff right out of a party conversation that somebody says and they write it down. So I'm going to think about that and where it comes from. So all of these things, he kept expanding not just my horizon in writing this, but his. And, there was this side of him that was, he didn't like the word spirit even. I mean, he debated Deepak Chopra once and felt Chopra was, way too into spirit versus soul, because soul, you have to dive deep as he's spoken about. But at the same time, he was, I think, a very spiritual man in the sense that he told me this story once about, he was very close to Henry Corbin, the Sufi mystic, and that he met at Eranos, these amazing gatherings that happened, once a year that he was invited to talk about psychology at. And he said, he talked one day about the blue vault, because I asked him, what in psyche made you turn to mythologies? And he said, well, one thing I did want to come to eventually was an experience I had in Isfahan in Iran in 1972. The mosque there is one of the great wonders of the world. And the ceiling is really extraordinary. All these blue tiles. But during the night, I was awakened. I couldn't stop seeing this blue world. And I told Corbin about it because I had lunch with him 2 days later. It was a very impressive experience. Now, the interesting thing about these mosques, as I learned there, here's the mosque. It was a big, beautiful door, and it would be here, not in front, but to the side. And you walk in, you go that way, and then you change direction to go inside, which is very different from our churches. It's a reorientation of your direction. And that was really interesting to me. So I had this thing that kept me awake, this vision of the ceiling of the mosque, which was more than the ceiling of the mosque. It wasn't a reproductive image of what I'd seen, but it was set off by that. And Corban said, well, the mosque did to you what it's supposed to do, so to speak. It opens up the heavenly vault. Quite powerful. Again, unexpected. So I hope what I'm giving you here is so the kind of the essence of the man as he unfolded his life to me, and it was an incredible experience to be part of. Volume 2, well, volume 1 ends with when he's about to get dismissed as director of studies at the Jung Institute. I'm not going to go into all the volume 1 material here, so I don't have time, and I want to focus on volumes 2 and 3. But it ends with him with the quote saying that because he was fired as director of studies after he had this affair with a patient, and that became a huge scandal in Zurich. And ironically, I guess, or whatever you want to call it, his own analyst, C.A. Meyer, who worked closely to Jung, had been at the same time having an affair with his wife, James's wife. Uncovered, that was not known either. So I ended volume 1 by saying that he was, with a quote from him, that I said, I'm out there on a limb and I find I like it very much. He didn't know what was coming next. And he stayed in Zurich. And volume 2 of the biography starts with a fascinating period where he started these things called meetings called Spring House. And maybe you've heard of Rafael Lopez Pedraza. He was this wild Cuban that was at the Jung Institute and that James worked with there for a long, long time. And they bounced ideas off each other that were absolutely essential to the beginnings of archetypal psychology. And they would have these meetings where in those days, a lot of younger people, including myself, but I wasn't there, but we're traveling. We were out there finding ourselves. And I spent a year and a half, quit my dream job at Sports Illustrated magazine when I was 23 and just traveled around the world for a year and a half with a backpack and a portable typewriter. And a lot of kids were doing that, people in their early 20s. And they came, a lot of them were drawn to Zurich, Bob Hinshaw and many others. Hinshaw never left Switzerland. But they would explore things like Don Camillo's Memory Theater, which was a Renaissance event, and the Picatrix, a medieval text, and these very obscure pieces of fascinating literature that nobody remembered anymore. And then they'd come up with these phrases like "stick to the image." That was Pedraza's main one, and "save the phenomena." And one time a drunk came crashing through the window from the outside, and Pedraza stands up. He says, "You see, we constellated." So those were quite some events, and I chronicle them at length in volume 2 of the book. And in the midst of that, actually toward the end of it, he got invited to give the Terry lectures at Yale. And I write about that quite a bit in the book as well, because that was a great honor for one. I mean, these were Jung gave the Terry lectures many years earlier. Famous scientists, really renowned people were invited to do this. And so he gave the foundations really of what became his book, Revisioning Psychology. He would give these talks, and Ed Casey remembered that he would exhaust himself. And by the end, I mean, he was like, how old was he? 40s, early 40s, but he'd end up giving the remainder of the last part of the lecture lying on his back in front of these huge audience. I mean, they were packed, right? And as he said, the gods enter through the symptoms, and the soul naturally pathologizes. So he came up with these four different areas: personifying, which personifying and polytheism require each other, that we are inhabitants of among all these entities that live inside us. Then he spoke about psychologizing or imagining things because the soul needs ideas. It's not about solving problems about how to live or love, but the invisible background that starts us questioning. Then he talked about dehumanizing or making soul. These were different lectures he gave, where archetype psychology is not a science, a religion, or a humanism, but a place from which to admire the height of mountains. Stilled realms with figures and fantasies are born of the imaginative heart, he said. And again, that the soul sees by means of affliction. So he spent really 25 years in Zurich with Pat Barry, who became his second wife, a wonderful colleague as well, and worked with him on, bringing out the ideas at Spring House. He started Spring Publications. She'd been a student of his when she first came to Zurich in 1966. And they were together for 20 years. And they moved together finally from Zurich to, of all places, Dallas, Texas. And again, to a lot of people thought that's really weird. Why is James Hillman going to Dallas, of all places? But, he loved the idea of exploring extroversion, as he said, and ostentation. I think he told me once, he said, when they say they need a lift, they mean a facelift. So he said, but he had these wealthy friends there, wonderful people, actually, Gail Thomas and Joanne Stroud, and he worked very closely with Robert Sardello. And again, they started at the University of Dallas under this amazing English professor named Louise Cowan, where again, a lot of young people were drawn to it. And they ended up in a big fight with the university over, I forget what exactly, but they got fired. He got fired from the University of Dallas. And then that led to the starting of the institute, the Dallas Institute of Humanities and Culture, where they would bring in speakers, and where he began to address things like what's happening with the buildings in the city. He said the city planning. He got into city planning. The buildings are anorexic. Business is paranoid. Technology is manic. So he equated, the built environment with psychology. And in the midst of that, because he was talking about, again, anima mundi, soul in the world. And he gave this lecture in Italy. He was asked to come and give the very prominent lecture in Florence. And I'm just going to read you again a brief thing what he had to say. Because it was a seminal lecture. The idea of a world soul, anima mundi as Neoplatonic philosophy once espoused, was new to contemporary psychology. Jung had introduced the concept of the collective unconscious, that the individual psyche lives inside a larger realm that is also ensouled. Jung's therapeutic emphasis, however, remained focused on the self and the process of individuation. To Hillman, this was missing an essential truth, that soul lives beyond the interiority of subjectivity and is in fact in everything, including man-made things of the streets. We are in it, this anima mundi, and it is thus demands attention beyond our private dramas. As he had journeyed south to Dallas to begin formulating it, now in the European south of the Mediterranean Italy, would come its first full articulation. Hillman called it at the time an attempt to restore Florentine psychology, Ficino, to the mainstream of thought. He wore a blue coat and black khaki trousers to the all-day affair in the Palazzo Vecchio. This massive fortress-like Romanesque building, crowned by the Arnolfo Tower, dates to the 13th century and is the most important civic monument in Florence, still serving as its town hall. Hillman described it as that amazing building that seems Kabbalistically rooted in the air. Hillman would speak in the tapestry-covered Great Hall. In come the gonfalones, he wrote to Raphael and Valerie. Men dressed in Renaissance vivid costumes with huge hats, carrying great banner and silver trumpets. Blow trumpets. Some people stand up, thinking it is a mass. They leave. They blew silver trumpets, so now I do not have to go to heaven, he wrote to Wolfgang Giegert. He said, I'm introduced and given the medal in the city, silver in a box, 600 people in the room, 200 on their feet, not enough chairs. The Roman Jungians prowling and scowling like leopards, hating it, envious, enraged that it was done without them and not real Jungian psychology. Then I stood up to talk. First time I had a tremor in the hands. Very difficult to do because I'd promised to do it in Italian as a gesture. So I gave my paper that had been translated for me that 1 hour and 20 minutes in almost faultless Italian. I practiced a great deal to get the rhythms and the accents and the intonations and came off okay. Though toward the end, I felt like Muhammad Ali in the 11th round being hit in the head and hit covering the body to keep standing up. Exhaustion, especially because I had to embody each word with my presence. For that is what a good lecture is, the embodiment of the words. But in a foreign language, very difficult. Hillman said near the beginning of his talk that he had come there to speak as a psychologist, a son of soul, speaking to psyche. To say son of soul is to speak in a Renaissance Florentine mode, following Marsilio Ficino, who was the first to place that soul in the center of his vision, a vision which excludes nothing of the world's affairs because the psyche includes the world. All things offer soul. So I described that amazing event, and Ficino, he brought back these figures from the Renaissance and back to the Greeks, some that weren't as well known, but he all this came out of Dallas and his time in Dallas, which he said of Dallas, it's the wound of America. And of course, that's where JFK was killed, and he started out there, like I said, with at the University of Dallas. I remember speaking of figures in the past, he once said to me, "What do you think Leonardo and Michelangelo would have talked about?" I didn't know what to say, right? Then he said, "How do you clean your brushes?" So again, that was vintage Hillman, right? So they moved to Connecticut as he turned 60. And they had this amazing party out of the Roaring 20s. I mean, it's just incredible. Everybody dressed to the hilt. But at the same time, his marriage was starting to fall apart with Pat. First, it had happened with Kate when he got together with Pat. He had 4 children with Kate. And I write quite a bit in volume 3. I have a whole long chapter about what the kids have to say. We weren't kids anymore, about James. And I think it's pretty enlightening about everything from his essay, Abandoning the Child, which he wrote. He kind of talked about how often these essays he wrote mirrored something in his life. And that's when he also got involved with the men's groups, which I'm going to, in part 2 of my talk today, I'm going to elaborate upon. It was also when he, in Connecticut, he was more and more, he worked with Charles Bohr, the poet, and was meeting all these other really interesting poets, Robert Creeley and Robert Duncan, very amazing friend of Hillman's. And he was formulating what he called the poetic basis of mind. So that's where I pretty much end volume 2 with that story. And he had, he knew that I'd have to do a second volume, that I couldn't fit everything into the first. So, and we'd talked about some of the themes in the second volume, while he was still living. But I'd never intended to write yet a third volume until, I don't know, it just kept expanding. Maybe I'm a verbose and I can't help myself. I don't know, but the third volume is very thematic, much more so than the first two, rather than as chronological. And but the third volume is also where I tell the story of the infamous event at Notre Dame uh, University, where all kinds of things happened, and you know, naked dancers coming on stage, outraging many of the people who were there. Um, Pat Berry gave a talk that was much too personalistic at the time, certainly for James, and anyway, it was. But I go through the book and I write. Of course, it's about his final works, and I'll stop in a minute and open for questions for a minute before I get to the second part. Um, but I've spent a lot of time doing interviews in Italy, talking. People there just adored Hillman. And later interviewed Higuchi from Japan, who was a very dear friend of his. And this is, of course, when he met Margot, who he spent his last 20 years with. And that's when he wrote several of the books that are much more accessible than some of his books, which are rather dense to people, but you know, amazing with what they get across. He never, you know, when he told me once that he ran into trouble even on the Soul's Code with the editors at Simon and Schuster, because they didn't like the way they thought he should open, you know, have subject, predicate, whatever. When you do a paragraph, you're supposed to complete the thought at the end, and he just didn't work that way. So that was hard for them to deal with. But the Soul's Code, of course, is his his best-selling book. He got on Oprah, who loved the book, and that pushed it to the top of the New York Times bestseller list. And there's, as most of you probably know, I mean, he writes about how we choose our parents. The soul chooses where we're going to come in. And what he called growing down, the acorn from the oak. He said, you know, it's also an idea in the Kabbalah, this idea of growing down, but that we have, at the time of our birth, an invisible daimon, D-A-I-M-O-N, that goes all the way back to, it's an invisible twin. It's with us. It's our higher self, really. So again, you know, some might say this is a very spiritual idea, and it is, I think. You know, it's like soul chooses the parents. Okay, and there's something bigger happening when we're coming in, and there are the ancestors too, as what he called guiding ghosts, and he was very interested in his ancestry. His grandfather on one side was a very famous rabbi named Joseph Krauskopf, and on the other side was a hotelier. So he grew up in this hotel milieu, hanging out down in the boiler room with the guys who were keeping the hotel running, and you know, learning about them. And at the same time, by day, there was this fantasy life that existed in Atlantic City. But he had an ancestor who fought in the Civil War. He had there was a very martial aspect to a number of his ancestors. So guiding ghosts means, you know, another guy was very big in the Revolutionary War. And, you know, so he was writing about people like Manolete, the bullfighter in the Soul's Code, who, using him as an example, because when he was 9 years old, he was hiding all the time behind his mother's skirt, because he sensed innately that, you know, one of these days he was going to be facing these bulls in the ring. So it was already inside him to manifest later. And he did this with all kinds of very interesting figures. And he talked about, you know, living life backwards, where you're not dwelling on victimization or parenting, but you're looking back on life in a very soulful way. And for him, I mean, that Soul's Code was very much activated during World War II, when he was in the Navy and he was working with men who were blind, taking care of them. It was his first experience of the therapeutic, and it marked him, you know, for the rest of his life. Then he became a journalist in the post-war years and traveled all over as covering what was going on in Europe, and then came Kashmir, and then a breakdown that led him to the Jung Institute. So, you know, he looked back upon Atlantic City when he was young as also very much part of what he was exposed to all these fantastic things going on, and you know, the high diving horse, and he talked about this a lot, that was such an important part of opening his psyche to possibilities. And his parents, you know, they had people coming over all the time. You know, he met Amelia Earhart, you know, he met Roosevelt's wife. They were involved in that kind of society. Halliburton, the great explorer, you know, which led him to want to go traveling all over the world later. And so I want to get into a couple of very personal aspects in the second half of this talk. One of them, I want to go through his time with the men's groups, which some of you may have heard about or not, but it was a really vital part of his later years, sort of the late middle age onward, and very different than what the mass media portrayed, which I'll be talking about. And then also what he gave me in the sense of a struggle that I was going through with my son. And he gave to me in more than one way, which I'll end the talk with. But for the moment, I'm open to any questions you might have about this kind of circuitous lecture. If anybody has some, even including on the Zoom, I guess, if they can do it that way.
I have a question.
Yeah.
You mentioned the shift from Pisces to Aquarius, and I really am interested in you know, the changing God image in this transition. And do you see, or did Hillman see, kind of the rebirth of the gods within the psyche? And how do you think that process is playing out so far?
That's a big question.
Yeah.
I think he did see that. I mean, or at least he saw his role as bringing that revival up, you know, in people, and recognizing the Dionysian aspects of life. And he wrote a lot about the gods and about monotheism and how it was really not taking us where we needed to go anymore. So in that sense, I mean, that's part of this, you know, new era. I don't like the words new age very much, but it is what we're entering. And yeah, and I think at the end of it, we're a lot of stuff's going down, you know, but we're on, yeah.
Yeah, but do you see it playing out that way? You know, if Mr. Hillman died more than 10 years ago, and with AI and all of these crazy changes, you know, how is that? How are things unfolding in this kind of transition era?
Well, I think I wish he was here to ask about that. I wished it a number of times, because when he was alive, we didn't think about AI. We didn't think about Donald Trump, you know, becoming president of the United States and all the changes he was going to make, and the division in the country, which he did see very clearly back, you know, in the early 2000s, that the country was so terribly divided, and he wrote about it. He saw, of course, the environmental aspect. He was very involved in the environmental movement. And we need to be obviously more in that world now because of what's happening, climate change. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, because I don't know the answer to it, really. I don't know what he would have said, but, and I wish I had, don't want to really look now for something to read you, but maybe I will when we come back, because the last chapter of volume 3 is, and I sort of cut it down to some degree, but is all of his comments that are so prescient for today. What's going on? He could, you know, he could envision it, and writes about it in terms of various things, education, and I'll look see if I can find one good quote to read you.
And sorry, one more question. Do you live phenomenologically? Sorry, as is if you have these competing gods within yourself, do you notice that when one of your energy is upsurging, if you're angry, you feel a more Martian influence, or if you're feeling more orderly today. You feel more Apollyon, more like Apollo. Like how does that interact within you as you discuss our?
Um, I'm again not sure quite how to answer it because I feel those energies. I don't always equate them with myth. Um, I got more into mythology about 10 years ago when I met this kid who was a genius in mythology, and I began mentoring him. Kid from the inner city. I mean, he was like, grew up on the streets, but he loved mythology, and he memorized all the myths. So he was kind of teaching me something that at that time I felt like I needed to know more about in writing the biography. So that was, I don't know, I guess there are these threads that come up in the larger sense that I've been blessed, really. I've always believed there, well, I know not always, I think for most of my life, that there's a path, long before I met James, that is set out that if we have choices as we go along, and we could take, we have free will. We don't have to follow what seems to be laid out for us, or we go in a different direction. But I've always believed that destiny is something that we all have in one way or another. And I felt it in my own life, to even I felt like meeting James Hillman was part of that. I didn't know it at the time, but I don't know what more to say about it than that, but thank you. Yes.
I want to add something to that question, because I always thought Hillman was very aligned with Jung's notion that the gods are being reborn through our diseases. And we see that so clearly these days, where the gods are coming through our diagnoses and that providing our identities and our path in life through the diagnosis. I wanted to bring up an issue that I was kind of startled listening to some of the differentiation of Hillman, something that I really hadn't thought about before. When you brought up Hillman's notion that psychotherapy analysis is limited into the personal psyche, and the necessity of us being connected to the anima mundi, which I think is essential. But I'm also experiencing it as a conflictual area these days. How do we participate as analysts?
Yeah.
How do we participate in the issues of our time with the people who are coming to us? And it sounded like, and I didn't really have a sense of this, that Hillman was differentiating individuation as something maybe too personal,
yeah,
in contrast to that. But I want to hold the notion that this is Jung's notion, that in the process of individuation, one accrues a debt. And that debt is to the anima mundi. But the path is through the individual, starting with ourselves. And I'm experiencing that these days as a kind of area of conflict in the field. Are we there to affirm a person's commitment to political processes or political positions, or are we there to follow the path of what we would call individuation, differentiation of self?
Yeah.
Which will put them in a position of being connected. Or do we skip that and go to, I have to affirm your allegiance to this cause? And I'm seeing that as something that's coming about in a conflictual way.
Yeah.
There's going to be a conference next year on activism, that we need to be activists. And how do we get that? Can we be an activist dealing with the individual in the process of the individual's personal development, or does it skip that or override it?
It's a big question.
A big question I really hadn't thought of in relation to Hillman before.
Yeah.
I assumed he was kind of in accord with Jung, but maybe there is more differentiation.
Yeah, I think what he found with the Red Book eventually was, he said it was, he gave lectures on the Red Book, and it changed his view of Jung too. I don't know if I can define it exactly, but he would say that he realized in reading the Red Book, going through it, that which of course was suppressed for many years before it was finally published by Sonu Shamdasani and his family. But he said, you know, he realized he and Jung had been on the same page the whole time. I'm going to read in the second part of this lecture about a dream that Hillman had about Jung, which may answer that question a little bit. So, yeah, thank you.
You mentioned the lecture he gave at Pacifica, where he said that, or if I remember well, that his psychology was not based on facts or on practice. So you investigated Hillman. Do you agree with what he said? Or because it seems hard for me to understand.
So that it was based on fact,
that his psychology was not quite based on his own practice.
Yeah.
It's not based on, even his dreams for me are facts. So I was wondering where he got this inspiration, basically.
Well, I think it was, yeah, the earlier things that I read here about his view of biography and about his own life.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, like the fact that he had, one time he told me a story about these two very famous philosophers he had dinner with, and he realized that they were so much more than he, you know, that was in his, he didn't have anything to say, you know, and so it was not about what he would gain from, you know, these different people that carried something that wasn't the fact of the dinner that was important to him. And I mean, obviously a biography is full of facts, and that they're important to it, but he always kept looking for the the greater meaning behind those facts. What was important about an event. It wasn't just an event. It was part of a pattern. His dreams, and he kept dream journals for many, many years. He never gave access to me to those or to anyone. But occasionally he would write about a dream he'd had. And it was very important toward the end of his life. In fact, I'll read it now it's not very long. Oops. It was a dream about Jung, which I found absolutely fascinating. So this was one of the last conversations that we had, actually. Well, not one of the last, but it was one time I'd gone to see him, and we were covering a variety of things, but he said, again, so here's a fact that on July 19th, 2007, he was reflecting on having once telephoned the renowned Kabbalah scholar Gershom Scholem to ask him a question about what he should study. They had never met or spoken. A friend couldn't believe he had the chutzpah to do such a thing. Later, he would get to know Scholem at Eranos. But then Hillman said, I'm beginning to understand it better. For the 25-year-old young man I was at the time, it was chutzpah. But to the daimon, it's not. 20 years later, I would be with Scholem at Eranos. I knew that's where I belonged. And that's the interesting part. If we don't read these things historically, but out of time, I have to come back to that point, a very important one. So that's kind of what we're talking about here. Then the conversation digressed for a short while before Hillman suddenly returned to the subject and said, as the tape recorder was running, you see, last night I had a very curious dream that ties in with this. I dreamt of Jung. Now, I've dreamt in my life at least 20 or 30 times of Jung. where he's talking to me, or I'm visiting him, or he's visiting. It's quite immediate. So last night he comes, and we're down in a boiler room or an engine room somewhere with pipes and an engine of some sort of like the hotel where he grew up. And he's working at it, and I'm surprised at how well he goes down and comes up, goes down to do something and then pops up again. I'm thinking at his age, he shouldn't still be moving that fast. And then he wants to know what I know. He asks me, "What have you discovered? What do you know?" And I tell him, it's not human history. It's something beyond that. It's something more than that. And he's very pleased to hear this. He asked, "Well, wasn't that exhausting or tiring? What about your energy?" Or something like that. I said, "No, I'm more energetic than ever. I get incredible energy from this." That's all. It's more than human history. The phrase was completely clear. So this thing about time, it's more than human history. Oh, and when I wrote it down in the middle of the night, I wrote, it's more than that or beyond that, like archetype. But it wasn't that clear, except it's something other beyond human history. It's enough to puzzle about it for a long time, a long time. But seems related to what you were asking me. I don't know. I think we should probably stop here, unless there's any other questions, and return, in about 10 minutes. The books are in the bookstore. I think the bookstore person is going to be there. If anybody wants to buy one and read one, I'm going to give you a discount. These are listed at $55. I'm going to sell them for $40 each, and I'll sign them. I have only a very few of volume 2 and 3. And then I have several of the book, My Mysterious Son, which also involves Hillman. And they have a couple of copies of that too. Okay. Well, we'll resume. Hope you're finding this worth your time. Oh yeah, okay. So what I'd like to do in this last 45 minutes or so is cover two big subjects. One of them is Hillman's work with the men's movement, which went on for more than a decade, starting in 1985, I believe. And I think it's a very little known aspect of, what this towering intellectual was doing with his life, and what it meant to him, and what it meant to me. Not that I was involved in the men's groups directly at that time, but James, what I want to get into at the end of the lecture is his vital influence on my life and my difficulties I was going through with my son. Not that he was my therapist or analyst, but he was extremely helpful. And then the mystery of my son, I want to talk about a little bit too, in terms of his own inner relationship with James Hillman. But let's start with the men's movement. So, do I have the light on here? Yeah, okay, we do.
It's the knob.
Yeah, got it. Okay. Hillman was at a very big transition period in his life in terms of endings. His relationship with Pat Barry was coming to an end. We were talking about the mid-1980s. Aranos, where he'd given these amazing lectures about psychology for a number of years, was ending at the time. He closed his practice. He'd been a practicing analyst for 40 years. And he needed something new, and it appeared. So it started with his friendship with the poet Robert Bly, that I'm sure many of you heard of, he'd written a book called Iron John. He came to write one, and he was very involved in starting what was called the mythopoetic men's movement. And they brought Hillman in as one of the key lecturers. And he would cover the mental part of it, and it would start each of these events, which were held in the woods in Mendocino, California, in the woods of Minnesota, different very beautiful places to hold a gathering, and they would bring together at each of these 100 men in the same room, never knew each other, from all different parts of the country, all walks of life, and they would just get into deep stuff together for a week. And it was, a lot of it was Michael Meade, who was the storyteller. And he would talk about, they used fairy tales and mythology and telling these stories, and then asking the group, well, where do you find yourself in this story? So there was this group of men, talking about a fairy tale from Russia, and it was quite something, but that the big media often portrayed as, it's just a bunch of guys going off in the woods, talking about their wives and making jokes. And it was so far from what that indicates. And shirtless males drumming and dancing. And it was, in fact, many, many women. And I interviewed a lot of people in the men's book because James wanted it to be a central theme or part of the book, which it is in volume 2. And many women, their husbands would come back after a week at one of these events, and they could not believe the change because guys were expressing their deepest feelings, and they could talk in a safe, environment with others about this. And Hillman saw it as doing therapy in a new way. He says, the patriarchy has suppressed men too. It's not just women. And again, the idea of the soul and the fact that the soul wants to descend and get into, by the way, a book of poems came out of this because they used poetry at great length. And James Hillman became close friends with people like Gary Snyder and Coleman Barks out of these meetings. Etheridge Knight, who was an African-American poet who spent most of his life in prison, incredible person. The first time he went, the book of poems, by the way, is called The Rag and Bone Shop of the Heart. And it's a wonderful, wonderful collection of poems that Bly, Hillman, and Meade sat down and picked out some of their favorites that were relevant to men, to the men's movement. The first time he showed up, he didn't know how you behaved at these kind of things. And so he carried in a ram's head. He was an Aries, so, he had a literal ram's head. And he announced to everybody there, my name is Fern. He had his whole, head covered in ferns. And it didn't go over that well. And so at that first gathering, suddenly the guys figured they were going to pull something on Hillman. So they had a naked man walk in, just enter the room, sit down. And Hillman just looked at him and said, oh, excuse me, would you stand up, please? I mean, he could just do this, right? And so they would get into, and he said, everyone, this endeared him to the group. Everyone is fucked up, including himself. And, but often it was, what they did was they organized these events through a series of they use elements, the elements, animals, colors. So you were living in kind of a poetic metaphor for a week, and you divide up into clans. Each clan had an animal name, and then subgroups around these 4 elements. And they would do things like make masks, and they do rituals with shrines that they would make from tree trunks of dead trees. The one rule was there's no physical violence. And things got pretty rough a lot of times. But they would have they replaced cocktail hour with what they called conflict hour, where, you'd get together and you'd talk about stuff that was bothering you right then at the gathering. And then they would do things like Hillman at one point, I tell the story in the book of how they did a ritual where one of the two men one of them would be blind, have a blindfold, so he couldn't see. And the other one would lead him into the woods. And Hillman completely fell apart because it reminded him, of course, of what he went through in the Navy when he was working with the blind. And so, it was touching these deep places in him as well. He said things that I jotted down and used. If you're visited by demons, be sure and listen because they have something to say. He said, the brain is full of blood, and I rearrange the furniture in your head. And sometimes things got so poignant. He'd say, let's take it out to the trees. They can hold it where we can't. He talked a lot about the importance of eros, among groups of men, not in a sexual way, but, about getting to the feeling that exists between males and how they take that home. And he even lectured on, taboo subjects, body parts, and he would just talk it out. And guys would have to think about these things that they've been reluctant to address. There was a time when somebody brought in the evening, brought a sex doll into the room. Thought it was really a funny thing to do. And, they were just kind of throwing it, batting it from one guy to another. And what Hillman did was when he got the sex doll, he danced it out of the room. Because by then he'd gotten into tap dancing. He learned tap dancing. He'd done a tap dance at his 60th birthday. And he just, of course, danced it out of the room. So it disappeared. So he would do things like that. And one time his son Lawrence came, who is a really fine astrologer, by the way. That's, as he said to me once in an interview, he was marinated in archetypal psychology. And so he became an astrologer. And it didn't know, at the time, they were pretty estranged. And they didn't know if they could connect. And they did. This happened to Laurence Olivier's son, too, the actor Laurence Olivier, whose son Richard became a very close friend and even went into business with James's son Lawrence. But I still remember that at the end of this men's group session, where they had managed to bond again, Hillman looked at him and said, without this, I would have thought I gave you nothing. But of course, that wasn't the case. And so these kinds of amazing and beautiful things were being discovered. And one of the gatherings, which was held in Buffalo Gap, West Virginia, came about after Michael Ventura, who wrote a book with Hillman that you may have seen. We've had 100 years of psychotherapy and the world's getting worse. And that was just a series of dialogues with Michael Ventura, the writer. They became really good friends. And Ventura one time wondered, I think he said it to Michael Mead, is this just white men's work? So it was decided, and it was a risky thing to do, to bring the 100 men together, half black and half white, and just get into it for a week. Meeting the fears of a lot of white guys of being mugged or talking about genocide against Native Americans. And there was one night things did erupt into these two guys fighting, in basically a death grip on the floor. And Michael Mead managed to talk them through it. So it got very, very intense. And Hillman wrote and gave a talk called Notes on White Supremacy. This is before the time when white supremacy was being talked about again as much as it is today. And, it's quite a talk, and I quote from it at some length in the book, how white was the supreme color and black was the absence of light, like in terms of how they were looked at. So this was not to justify white supremacy, but it was to show the roots of it as he did with war and what was really all about, what to think about. He tap danced too at some of these things. And it was one time, I think it was Buffalo Gap, where the drum they did a lot of drumming at these events, and a ceramic drum broke. And so what they did, rather than piece it back together, was everybody took home a piece of it. And when they got to the airport, John Densmore told me this. He was the drummer for the Doors, and he was very close to Hillman for a while there. And he remembered going in a car to the airport, black men and white men sitting together in the car, and nobody wanted to leave the car. I mean, it was that powerful an experience that they'd been through. And one of the men who was there and became one of the teachers became very instrumental in my life as well as James's. And his name was Malidoma Somé. He was from West Africa. And someone that Hillman always told me, you've got to talk to Malidoma. He'd come to this Buffalo Gap meeting and for the first time told his story, which was remarkable. And he writes about it in a book called Of Water and the Spirit. And it's a story of how he grew up in Burkina Faso. He was born in Burkina Faso, which was very dominated by a Jesuit order, from outside. And he'd ended up being given to or sold to, basically, the Jesuits when he was less than 5 by his parents. And so he grew up in a Jesuit community and forgot his native language. It was not an easy thing for him. And when he turned 20 or 21, I think, he ran away. And I don't know if he was abused or whatever, something happened that he made his way back to his village, which was a long way away. And when he got there, they didn't want to accept him because, they hadn't seen him in all these years. His father was still alive. His grandfather, however, had been a very prominent shaman among the Dagara people. And so they finally agreed to let Malidoma go through the initiation ritual that most of the younger men in the tribe did when they were about 14 years old. So, I mean, he was, tied to a tree, barely made it through, but he did. And then he went on to study at the Sorbonne in Paris, eventually Boston University, and become what his grandfather said his mission in life was to become friends with the stranger. So the first time that he ever told his story was at this Buffalo Gap meeting. And people were just, oh my God, to hear him speak about it and realize who he was. And he did rituals at Buffalo Gap and later, because he became one of the speakers, joining the roster of Hillman, Mead, and Bly. And he and James would do rituals together. James remembered him brushing him with a feather, and some very, very powerful things that they did together. And as I say, James always told me that you've got to talk to Malidoma. I did talk to him on the phone at the time. I didn't meet him yet. But then there came a time so after James had died, and I want to regress just a little bit because what I want to tell you now is about my son and what Malidoma ended up doing for us. But at the time, my son he's biracial. He had been diagnosed with mental illness when he was 17, when he had a breakdown. They said it was schizoaffective disorder, schizophrenia. We went through his mom and I and close friends, a very rough period of time for a long time, where he was in and out of group homes and hospitals. And I ended up suing the Eli Lilly because the Zyprexa that they subscribed, was just devastating in terms of the side effects. And my son put on 100 pounds, and they did a class action suit. People could join, and so we got somewhat of a settlement from them. And there was a period of time my son went to a place called Earth House in New Jersey, which was just wonderful. Very expensive, though. And I had some help from my brother and others, but he finally couldn't remain for more than the year that he'd been there. But it was, very healthy diets. He lost 100 pounds. I mean, he was in really much better shape after Earth House, which was in, I guess, 2009. There was a period that I went to see James to do interviews, and we were riding along in the car, and he said, is there something bothering you? You could tune into those things. He said, what, is it your son? And I said, yeah, it is. And I told him that, you know, how we'd go out and my son would, his name is Franklin, would enter these delusions, and it made me so uptight. You know, he'd say things, oh, I did this, I built this over here. And then he would, you know, make up stuff wherever we went and have these imaginary conversations. And I would get very nervous when I was taking him to a restaurant or whatever. And then Hillman said some amazing things. First, he said, you know, that this is a very mysterious disease. Einstein's son had it, James Joyce's daughter, Picasso's mother. And he said, what you need to do is approach this differently than the therapeutic. Abandon being the responsible father. He said, even your solicitude is confining to him. It's important to respect resistance. And chronos is about time. So don't look for improvement. It's really walking along with him, accompanying, accepting. Enter the delusion with him. Treat him normally. Nobody treats him normally. They all treat him like a sick person. So try that. Just enter it with him. Enter his world. And I tell you, once I started doing that, it was the best advice anybody had ever given me. And we went to a restaurant after that, a Chinese place, and that we always enjoyed going to when I was living in Boston. He was in Boston too, at a group home at the time. And I think I remember the waiter coming by, and he started talking to him in a made-up Chinese. But instead of getting uptight about it like I always did, I just kind of was bemused and, you know, went along with it. And then he suddenly looks at the waiter. He says, "Oh," he says, "don't worry." He said, "You and I are speaking in Mandarin, but he only understands Cantonese." So it was pretty. And then we just cracked up. You know, we started to laugh, and we started having, you know, these kind of wonderful conversations together. And it was a beautiful thing that Hillman had passed along to me in a real archetypal way. And I had a dream one night where I was talking to some professors and hearing that my task was to unlock a secret about mental illness that my son carried. And something Martin Luther King once said, what struck me as I was preparing this lecture: human salvation lies in the hands of the creatively maladjusted. And my son was an artist. He loved to paint, draw, and make these incredible little sculptures. Then he was very in tune to the fact that I was doing this biography with James Hillman. He never met him, but one time he said to me, "My birthday is April 12th. Sun conjunct Moon and Sun and the Moon conjunct in Aries, conjunct Neptune." Now, I never even talked about James Hillman's chart with him, but he was very interested in astrology, and he could actually tune in to these kinds of things. And once in a hospital, I remember he introduced himself as C.G. Ming. And another time he said, he was talking about Hillman, he said, "Oh yeah, I know about him. He wrote the human genome." I said, "Well, no, Franklin, it was actually the soul's code." He says, "Well, that's what I mean." So it was like, and then after Hillman died, he was seeing corpses in the carpet at his group home and hearing voices of the dead. He told me after the memorial later for Hillman, "You should go into dancing, tap dancing." Again, all of this out of the blue. So after James died, I think it was 2012, I was really desperately searching for not necessarily an alternative to psychotropic medications, but an adjunct, something that he could do that, which I wished I'd known about when he was younger, when all they said was, oh, put him on all these drugs, because the side effects were very debilitating. And he hated them and he went off them, a lot of times. And so I was looking for something. And I went to this sort of alternative event. And there was a woman there who talked about shamanism. I thought, well, that's interesting. I just read this book called The Horse Boy about the writer taking his autistic son to Mongolia and what a great impact it had on him when he was, searching for something like this. And it was just riding the horses and so on. So, I was listening to this about shamanism, and then I found out there was a woman who lived in Maine who was a practicing shaman, who might be helpful. So my wife and I went to see her, and she was really amazing. But at the end of the day, Alice said, because again, my son's biracial, she said, what about malodoma? And it hadn't occurred to me. So I found that malodoma was was coming to Ojai, California, to do divinations. So I made an appointment to see him, first time I'd met him. And a divination is, you have this cloth in front of you that has all of these objects on it, coins and beads and stones. And if you're male, you move all of these in a clockwise direction until the shaman tells you to stop. And then he reads the pattern. And what he told me was, your ancestors don't know who he is, and they need to give him a place at the table. So I had this series of rituals assigned to me, and ended up going to the beach in Malibu with apple cider vinegar and vodka and kernels of corn, and returning these things to the sea. Then I took him to Jamaica, took Franklin to Jamaica, where Malodoma was doing a thing for a few days. And they met. And Malodoma said, it's like meeting a colleague. Because, in traditions like in Africa, the shamans are considered shamans, but they also have characteristics because they live so much in the other world that they could be considered in our culture schizophrenic, so-called. They're hearing voices, or they're talking to beings, and things that had happened to my son. And so one thing that I kept seeing Malodoma for several years. And one day I was there for a divination, and he said there's something wrong with, something was off with what I was doing. And so he said there was a horseshoe on there, but the horseshoe that formed in the pattern looked like a shackle. And he said, there's something I need you to do. I need you to find a slave shackle. And I need you to take it to the middle passage where Franklin's mother's ancestors came across, and return it to the sea. I went, what? I'm supposed to find a slave shackle? How am I going to do that? Well, I did find one on eBay. And I actually bought it for a few $100s. And when it came, I found I couldn't open it. And I just left it there on my desk. And then eventually I did some research and figured, well, I'll take Franklin to see his mom in Baltimore. And I'll go to, my idea was to go to Frederick Douglass's house, which still existed. You couldn't find it on the tourist maps, but you could locate it. And then that was where I was going to maybe do something with the shackle. So I didn't talk about this at all. But funny, because on the way in the car, Franklin talked about how there'd been Russells in the military, and they were involved with the Creek Indians. And Henry Russell was, I found out later, had a slave with him, and the slave was killed when they were moving through the West with Daniel Boone a long time ago. So I set out one morning with the shackle, which I still hadn't opened. And I went to Frederick Douglass's house, and people there they were quite kind of lowlifes, and then they were not happy to see me. And so then I ended up going to the creek where Douglas, as a boy, would fish. And there I opened the box. And I drove on to Cambridge, Maryland, where Etta's ancestors had come from, and come to from West Africa. And I went to the Harriet Tubman Museum, and I watched the movie that was happening there. And at the end of it, I walked up. There was a one plaque on the wall, and I walked up and read the plaque, and it was an offer of a reward in 1850 or something for an escaped mulatto slave and his family, signed by William Russell. And I don't know of a William Russell in my heritage, but it obviously did me a turn. I mean, I was like, whoa, it shook me, really shook me. And I went to the water and found that there was a boat going out in the morning, a replica of an 1812 whaling ship, not whaling ship, but sailing ship. So I booked a passage on it, and I went and spent the night in a hotel, got up in the morning, and I was like in another world. I was shaking. I was, reading about this ancestor, Henry Russell, that was, with the Creek Indians. I was finding these things online that Franklin had tuned into. And so I ended up, called my wife, and my watch stopped. Watch I'd had on my wrist for years. It wouldn't start again. It started again later, but so I was out of time. I was completely out of time. And got up finally to go to the water. And as I was walking out, the writer Ta-Nehisi Coates was on TV talking about reparations for slavery. So all this was really pretty, you can imagine, really scary and amazing. So I went out on this replica of the 1812 ship and didn't know what to do because it was full of tourists. I didn't know. I had the shackle in a black bag on my shoulder. How was I going to do this without somebody seeing me? But finally, something opened up, and I went to the front of the boat and took it out. Said, "Take it, water spirit," and I threw it into the Chesapeake Bay. And something changed. I mean, it was like something lifted from me or opened, and it was a huge moment that Malidoma had given me. And we ended up later going to, I wrote about it in My Mysterious Son. Eventually I decided to write a book about this experience because Franklin had really taught me, and James Hillman had first opened that door, but a lot about other worlds and about the connection between our souls here and wherever we come from or are going. So it was we ended up going into Burkina Faso in 2016. There was a bunch of people on the same trip, but Malidoma had often spoken of the need for Franklin to go to his village in Africa. And so we did, and we spent a month there. Franklin's mom, who I was still close friends with, and myself and Frank, and it was truly amazing. I mean, we were prescribed these big pots, each of us, with herbs in them, specially tailored for each of us. By this holy man who was kind of like the Wizard of Oz. He was in the back room of this place in sort of a tented area, and we went there with Malidoma, and we had to breathe into a Bic pen with our question, or what were we trying to achieve? And that pen was taken by the holy man's son, who was in his almost 100 years old, I think, who then read the pattern and prescribed to us these pots. And so we would bathe and in them and bathe and also drink from them, every day for a period of time. And we would also have to go through things with animals, we went and visited these goats and we went out among the chickens, and it was truly amazing. And then there was a bull that was going to be sacrificed for us. And we went through that. And it changed a lot of things. By the time we went home, Franklin looked completely different. And he decided, he agreed to go off. He thought he was going to talk to his psychiatrist at home about going off slowly medication. And he did. Over the next year, he reduced it to nothing really, which was a mistake on the analyst's part, because then he had kind of a crash. But now he's living with his mom in Baltimore, and has been for some years, and he's doing great. So it was definitely an alternative route that was opened for me and our family through James Hillman and Malidoma, for which I will be eternally grateful. So I'm gonna, yeah, what else did I have to say about that over there in Burkina Faso? I mean, there were so many things that happened. The holy man, I remember, looked at Franklin's drawings, and he said, these are genie inspired, part of the subspace realm. Malidoma was struck by an invisible dart at a funeral, people who resented him bringing all these, white people over there, I guess. When we did the chicken rituals, the chicken had to fall on its back. If it didn't, you had to, it was an offering that was going to the ancestors. So, I spent a lot of time in Africa when I was young, when I was traveling. But this was, of course, deeply personal and quite remarkable, to say the least. Hillman said in Lament of the Dead, which was his last book that he did with Sonu Shamdasani, shortly before he died, he said, God is that which crosses my willful path. I'll never forget leaving that camp, the small village in Burkina Faso. And when we departed, the holy man looked at the sky saying, it's in the hands of God, whatever would happen next. And I'm not a staunch Christian or anything, but it was like, yeah, this is real. And I think what I do to kind of wrap this up and then answer any questions that you have is with a quote first from Hillman about the men's groups and what they represented to him. Yeah, here we go. It's an essay that he wrote called What We Are About is the Broken Heart. The question that we began with, and it came up again and again, is what is this conference about? What are we here for? And I think what we're about is the broken heart. And whether we feel the broken heart in our personal stories of our marriages, the deaths in the family, the Vietnam War, or the relationship with the father, there's a broken heart. And it's the broken heart of America. It's the broken heart of our society. I don't think that we should talk about the healing of the broken heart, but to realize that it's there, and that's what love is really all about. That's where love comes in, through the broken heart. Heartbreak is what it's all about. Heartbreak. What has happened here is the experiencing of the heartbreak of America. This has been something different than an experience. We've been inside the heartbreak of America. It's been personal. We each have our own piece of that heartbreak, but we also are the heartbreak. Broken, our hearts broken in the heart of the country, broken into fragments which we call our neighborhoods, ethnic colors, and so on. And what's happened here has been that the spirit and the images that live in the heart or connect with the heart have met, and the souls have met. Maybe each of us as embodied ego people have not all met, and there's huge resistances in that meeting, but the souls have met and the spirits have met. It doesn't mean that they love each other. It doesn't mean that they all dance together, but they've met. And that keeps the heart alive, because it's only the heart that is isolated or sealed or complacent or self-content that isn't feeling that is broken. Feeling that it is broken. It doesn't feel the heartbreak, and that is the danger. So what I want to leave with is not healing. I want to leave with that awareness of heartbreak. And I thank you for making me feel that intensely. And in volume 3, I ended with a sort of a personal afterword that I want to just share the very end of. A personal aside with a dream I jotted down in 2015, a few years after his death. I'm climbing a steep mountain with James Hillman and a woman just behind me. At first, I hadn't realized how treacherous it is, with packed ice and snow at different junctures. I tell James I'm worried about slipping and falling backwards into him, but he urges me to go on. We're more than halfway up and trying to reach a house at the summit. James also hadn't realized it would be this difficult to ascend, but he seems up for the challenge. He's relaxed, with a smile on his face. He seems to have complete confidence that I won't trip and tumble into him, cascading us both down the mountain. 7 years since that dream occurred, I guess I finally reached the peak. So at this point, I'll take a few more questions, and I'll take questions from the Zoom audience if they have some. And as mentioned before, the bookstore has volumes 2 and 3, and I'd be happy to sign copies to any of you who want to get one before I leave.
Thank you.
Any questions?
Thank you for sharing that very personal story about your son. How is he doing? You said he's doing well, and what is he doing these days?
Yeah, he's doing really well. He has a shop out back of his house, and he does a lot of very unusual sculptures out of all kinds of natural stuff, you know, from everything from trees or from different parts of machines, and it's very unusual. I mean, and he's also still doing his paintings, some of which I have in the book, The Mysterious Son, reproduced, and so he's doing great. I mean, this is his birthday today, actually. And so I called him this morning. I wish him happy birthday. And he and his mom are out. We continue to make trips together occasionally, go someplace that he's interested in going. And I couldn't be happier, actually, with how he's turned many corners in his life, and now in his later 40s, and he's still, you know, he also goes out every day and goes to this place called Open Works to build things, and he's he drives, you know, with his mom, and calls me almost every day just to say hi, check in, and don't talk too long, and then he says, okay, call you again. Anyway, so yes, I think he's been a long, hard road, but he's doing great. Yes.
I wanted to ask about something you mentioned in the first part of the lecture. I wondered if you could expand on what Hillman said about the shadow side of therapy and how that's connected to a Christian redemption story. I wonder if for him, the alternative to that would be a sort of tragic pre-Christian classical story, or I just would be interested to hear your.
Yeah, well, I think he was always believed the shadow work was very important, and that we should all, you know, find out what our shadow is as much as possible, and live with it, and realize it's the limitations that we have. And so I don't know that he certainly never condemned shadow work. But I would say that the idea, which I mentioned earlier too, of the pre-Christian gods, and you know, the importance of Dionysus and Zeus and Icarus, and you know, you name it, especially the Greeks were they do inhabit us, and they're still there to learn something from. And whereas I think too much emphasis is placed on, literal interpretations of the Bible, for example, which don't really help as much. So I think that's the way he viewed it.
And I thought you were saying, maybe I heard you wrong. I thought you were talking about the shadow of therapy.
That's what I understood you to be saying. There was a list of, I think, 8 points, and the seventh, I think, was about therapy itself having a shadow.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, I missed that somehow. Okay. The shadow of therapy, yes. I don't know if I answered to it or not, but
What was Hillman's conception of an afterlife? If he
he didn't know, and he didn't pretend to know. I think he was definitely, you would think it would be there, because if the soul chooses its parents, and there is an afterlife that the soul exists in of some kind. So, but he didn't like to do those kind of speculations. Very.
I just want to have a reaction to, it reminded me of something, the shadow of therapy. It reminded me of a time when I was talking to James Hillman about a case I was working on, and he was giving me some supervision, and he told me to, as a general orientation, this goes back a long time ago, so we didn't do payment online. He told me to put the check on the table between us and leave it there. Not just for that patient, but as an ongoing orientation in the work, to have the money present. And that's a kind of shadowy area.
Yeah.
When I bring that up with colleagues, there's a kind of hesitancy to acknowledge that, yes, I'm here for the money. No, I'm here to do good.
Right.
I'm here for the money. Here's the money. It's on the table. That's why I'm with you.
Yeah.
That's just
Yeah. That's very interesting. Thank you for bringing that up. Okay.
I am on Zoom, if I may still ask a comment
Sure.
or something. Thank you for the talk and for sharing with us the personal story of your son and yourself. As I was listening to you, I was thinking of the challenge that you went through. It's an almost impossible challenge of writing a biography about somebody that told you it's not about the facts. And you are a journalist, so thinking of Hillman's choice of you to write his biography is, it's like a reflection of his approach to the image, to the symbol, and to facts. And to write a biography and go beyond the facts is, I felt, a consistent conflict and a challenge that is so difficult to overcome. And when you gave him the 8 subject matters, when he asked you to, I found it fascinating because none of them are really about facts. And when you said he read it and accepted it, it was a reaffirmation of his choice.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was, I was wondering the whole time, how does one write a biography of a man who doesn't want to go by facts? And that's also the dream he had of Jung, who told him, don't go by the historical facts.
Yeah. Well, that's true. But all I can really say about that is that every time I went to see him, and this was especially true in the latter part of his life, after the biography was, we're nearing completion, and he had been ill or was becoming ill. It was always he wanted to go deeper than we'd gone before. I think he'd realized that, you've gone out, you've interviewed all my friends, and you've come up with, building quite a picture, which he actually, interestingly, now that you mentioned it, I think he came to enjoy. I think he came to appreciate the facts of his life that he maybe hadn't put together in certain ways that having to do that biography about him was doing. And because he would chuckle about things, and he would go over, you know, it was hard for him to talk about, he'd never talked about the affair that he'd had in Zurich. It cost him the studies group, the director of studies, but he knew that that was something that had happened, but I couldn't leave it out because people would say, what are you doing writing this, you know, thing about him without mentioning these difficult things he went through? He wanted to address the difficult parts. And so he came to appreciate that, I think, in a way that he didn't, it was new, you know, it was new to him.
So through the work he did with you, he ultimately saw the pattern on the carpet.
He did. I think so. Yeah. Yeah. The Henry James's pattern in the carpet. He knew that's what I had to do as a biographer if he was going to allow it to happen, which he did. And then little by little, the pattern emerged. And one thing that I think we had in common was, another thing we had in common was that I had all my life since I was a teenager, believed not in a histrionic sense really, but I had some kind of destiny. I had something that there was a path that I was going to have to find to follow, and which I then, you know, had experiences that led me to do that, to be able to do it, although I could have turned in a different direction. And he did the same thing. You know, he could have stayed in Kashmir and written his great novel, but when he had an experience with this Indian guru, it's a great story actually, that he was guru told, Gopi Krishna was his name, and he told James that, you know, you must go to the mountain. That's where you'll have the big dream. It's on the mountain. And when he went to the mountain, he had a dream about his mother and his grandmother in bunk beds. And he was so shaken by that he went down the mountain and into Zurich and to get together with Jung. So, and I'd had experiences, you know, in my life that I knew there was a pattern laid out for me that I could and in many cases did follow. So we were always, I don't know, I guess the two of us were always looking for something bigger, you know, something that was about the daimon. And, you know, the facts would obviously play into it, but this bigger thing was always there that I had to search for and he had to acknowledge.
Yeah. Okay.
Hope I answered
Thank
your
you.
question.
It's a more personal question, but what did you learn from writing?
Oh God. I think you know, he told me at one point early on, he said, welcome traveler. In other words, you're going to travel down some roads that you may not expect to have gone through. And I did, you know, I mean, especially after he was gone, you know, I went through some very, very soul searching times. I'd never been in therapy. I went into therapy. My wife and I split up for a time. There was a lot of stuff that I had to look at that I think I thought back on it. I thought, you know, he forecast that. He knew that I needed something from this that was beyond fact, you know, that it was about what the world I was exploring that I was unfamiliar with, much of it. I mean, I can't stand here today and say I'm an expert in archetypal psychology. I'm not. But, you know, I worked hard at getting the facts right and then having to go through what I did, you know, with Malodoma, with Franklin, with all these different aspects of my life as I got older. I guess that's what I would say. I learned more to roll with the punches that I wasn't looking for, I guess, you know, and yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing this story on the day of son's birthday.
Yes, he's turning 47 today, and we're also having a memorial service at home for young member of my extended family who died unexpectedly at only 53. So I got to go home to that as well. There's a lot going on now that's very, very painful in the country and, personally, but, I think we're entering a new era that hopefully we're going to find vital and important. So thanks everybody for coming, and like I say, the books are around. I'll stick around a little bit while longer if you want me to sign. Thank you.